Hello everyone, welcome to our channel, TJ Comments and Answers. I hope all of you are doing well. In this video, we will analyze and answer the questions from this week's Watchtower study. The study covers the week of September 23rd to 29th and is titled, Let's Stay on Guard So As Not to Fall into Temptation. Without further ado, let's begin. Let's look at questions 1 and 2, Part A. What warning did Jesus give? Jesus told his disciples that they should stay awake and pray constantly so as not to fall into temptation. Additional comments. Matthew 26:41, Jesus warned that it is crucial to pray and stay spiritually awake. This warning emphasizes that we must rely on prayer to stay strong against temptations, as prayer strengthens our connection with Jehovah and gives us the power to not give in. Matthew 26:41, Jesus pointed out that, while the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. This lesson reminds us that our human nature makes us vulnerable, and without Jehovah's help, we could easily fall into temptation if we are not on guard. Let's move on to questions 1 and 2, Part B. Why did the disciples fall into temptation? See also the images. The disciples fell into temptation because they did not follow Jesus' advice. They didn't stay on guard or pray, and when Jesus was arrested, they abandoned him out of fear. Additional comments. Matthew 26:56, the disciples abandoned Jesus because they did not stay awake and alert. This lesson teaches us that if we do not remain vigilant and strengthen our faith, we can fall into temptation when faced with difficult situations. Matthew 26:56, despite their good intentions, the disciples fell because they did not pray or stay alert. This teaches us that good intentions are not enough if we are not spiritually prepared. Let's move on to question 3, Part A. Why can't we be overconfident if we want to be faithful to Jehovah? We can't be overconfident because, although we want to be faithful, we are imperfect and vulnerable to temptation. We may face situations that are very difficult to resist. Additional comments. Romans 7:21-23, Paul talks about the internal struggle between doing what is right and human imperfection. This teaches us that, even if we want to be faithful, imperfection makes us vulnerable to temptations, so we shouldn't trust in our own strength. Romans 5:12, we all inherited sin from Adam, which means there will always be an inclination toward wrongdoing within us. This reminder teaches us to always be alert and never let our guard down against temptation. Let's move on to question 3, Part B. What will we see in this article? In this article, we will see in what areas we should be careful, how to protect ourselves from temptations, and what to do to stay on guard. Let's move on to the first subheading, in what areas should we stay on guard? Let's look at questions 4 and 5. Why should we stay on guard against committing less serious sins? Although some sins may not seem as serious, they can damage our relationship with Jehovah and lead us to commit bigger mistakes. Each person has different weak points, and it's important to identify them to avoid falling into temptation. Additional comments. James 1. 14. This text reminds us that sin begins with a desire. Small sins may seem harmless, but if not controlled, they can grow and lead us to commit more serious mistakes. It's crucial to stay on guard even with the smallest sins. Galatians 6:1. Paul warns that even those with spiritual qualities must watch themselves. This teaches us that no sin is insignificant and that we must be mindful of our weaknesses so they don't drag us into bigger sins. Let's move on to question 6. What should we recognize? We must recognize what our weak points are and not think that we are so strong that we could never fall into temptation. Even those with strong spiritual qualities must be careful. Additional comments. 1 John 1:8. This verse teaches us that if we deny we have weaknesses or sins, we deceive ourselves. It's important to acknowledge our areas of vulnerability so we can work on them and avoid falling into temptation. 2 Corinthians 13:5. Paul advises Christians to examine themselves to see if they are in the faith. Recognizing our weaknesses is the first step to correcting them and staying strong against temptation. Let's move on to question 7. What points should we protect the most? Give an example. We should especially protect our weak points. For example, in biblical times, the city gates were the most vulnerable areas, which is why they were heavily guarded. Similarly, we must reinforce our defenses in areas where we are weakest. Additional comments. 1 Corinthians 9:27. Paul mentions that he disciplines himself so that he is not disqualified. This teaches us that if we know our weaknesses, we must take concrete steps to control them and not let them grow, ensuring we do not fall. Galatians 6:1. Here we are taught to be humble and watch ourselves constantly. If we identify our weaknesses, we must strengthen those areas, as ignoring them can make us vulnerable to temptations. Let's move on to the second subheading: how can we protect ourselves? Let's look at questions 8 and 9. What should the young man in Proverbs chapter 7 have done to avoid committing a serious sin? The young man should not have taken the steps that brought him closer to sin. He walked near the woman's house, stayed when she kissed him and spoke to him. If he had avoided those steps, he would not have committed the sin. Additional comments. Proverbs 7:8-9. The young man passed near the house of the immoral woman. This teaches us that we must avoid even approaching situations that could tempt us, as getting close puts us at risk of falling into sin. Proverbs 7:13-21. Instead of rejecting the immoral woman, the young man allowed her to convince him. This teaches us that to avoid sin, we must stay away from any situation that could feed our improper desires, without giving room for temptation. Let's move on to question 10. Like the young man in Proverbs, what mistake could someone make today? Someone today might think they fell into a serious sin, suddenly, but if they look back, they probably took several steps that brought them closer to temptation, like choosing bad company or stopping participation in spiritual activities. Additional comments. Proverbs 7:22. The young man followed the woman suddenly, but in reality, he took several steps that led him to sin. Today, someone might think they fell into sin suddenly, but if they look back, they'll see they made small decisions that brought them closer to temptation. 1 Corinthians 10:12. This verse reminds us that if we think we are standing firm, we should be careful not to fall. The mistake may lie in being overly confident and not realizing the small steps that lead us toward sin. Let's move on to question 11. If we don't want to commit a sin, what should we do? We must not only avoid sin but also avoid situations or small steps that could lead us to commit it. This means staying away from anything that could put us in danger. Additional comments. Proverbs 5:8. It urges us to stay far from the path of sin, not to approach it. This teaches us that the key to not committing a sin is to avoid any situation that brings us closer to temptation, even if it seems harmless. Proverbs 7:25. Here we are warned not to follow the paths that lead to sin. Instead of just resisting the sin itself, we must avoid the steps that lead us toward it. Let's move on to question 12. What decision did Job make, and how would it help him stay on guard? Job 31:1. Job made the firm decision not to look inappropriately at other women. This commitment would help him avoid the temptation to commit adultery. Additional comments. Job 31:1. Job made a covenant with his eyes not to look at a woman inappropriately. This example teaches us that making firm decisions in advance, like avoiding even improper thoughts, helps us stay on guard against more serious temptations. Job 31:1. By making a covenant with his eyes, Job protected himself from sinful thoughts and actions. This teaches us that if we make firm resolutions regarding our weaknesses, we'll be better prepared to avoid falling into temptation. Let's move on to question 13. Why should we be careful with what we think? Because bad thoughts can lead us to desire to do bad things, which in turn puts us at greater risk of falling into temptation. It's important to reject those thoughts and replace them with good ones. Additional comments. James 1:14-15. Sin begins with a desire that grows within us. This teaches us that we must guard our thoughts, because if we don't control them, those thoughts can become desires that lead us to sin. Philippians 4:8. Paul encourages us to think about good and uplifting things. If we keep our minds focused on positive and spiritual thoughts, it will be harder for bad thoughts to grow and turn into temptations. Let's move on to question 14. What else will help us stay on guard to avoid falling into temptation? Being fully convinced that obeying Jehovah is always the best choice. Even though it can be difficult at times, the peace we feel from doing what is right is worth all the effort. Additional comments. Matthew 26:41. Jesus teaches us that constant prayer keeps us spiritually strong and helps us avoid falling into temptation. This reminds us that prayer is a powerful tool to resist sin. Hebrews 10:24-25. By gathering with other believers, we receive encouragement and support, helping us stay strong in our faith. The company and counsel of spiritually strong brothers and sisters help us stay on guard against temptations. Let's move on to question 15. How does cultivating proper desires help us? If we learn to love what is good and hate what is bad, it will be easier to resist temptations. It also helps us stay strong in the face of unexpected situations. Additional comments. Amos 5:15. This text tells us to love what is good and hate what is bad. When we cultivate these proper desires, we'll be more inclined to do what pleases Jehovah and less prone to be swayed by temptations, as our hearts will be in tune with what is right. Psalm 119:97. The psalmist expresses his love for Jehovah's law. This teaches us that by meditating on and loving God's teachings, our desires will align with His will, and that love for what is right will help us resist evil and temptations. Let's move on to question 16. Why do spiritual activities help us stay on guard? Participating in spiritual activities like meetings, preaching, and prayer keeps us focused on pleasing Jehovah and helps us resist temptations. Additional comments. Matthew 28:19-20. Jesus gave us the mandate to make disciples, which involves staying active in the preaching work. Participating in spiritual activities strengthens our relationship with Jehovah and keeps us busy with things that please God, keeping us away from temptations. Hebrews 10:24-25. This verse highlights the importance of gathering together and encouraging one another. By being involved in spiritual activities, we receive support from our brothers and sisters and strengthen our faith, helping us stay alert against any weaknesses or temptations. Let's move on to the third subheading, Never Let Your Guard Down. Let's move on to question 17. What negative tendency did Peter have to struggle with more than once? Peter struggled several times with the fear of what others thought of him. Although he overcame it on one occasion, later he had problems with it again when he stopped eating with non-Jewish Christians out of fear of what others would say. Additional comments. Matthew 26:69-75. Peter denied Jesus 3 times out of fear of others' opinions. This experience shows that Peter had the tendency to be swayed by the fear of man, a challenge he faced more than once, and which can affect our decisions if we are not on guard. Galatians 2:11-12. Later, Peter again showed fear of what others thought when he stopped eating with Gentile Christians for fear of criticism from the Jews. This example teaches us that some weaknesses can resurface repeatedly if we don't control them. Let's move on to question 18. What can happen with some weaknesses? We may think we have overcome a weakness, but it can reappear if we are not alert. It is necessary to keep fighting every day. Additional comments. 1 Corinthians 10:12. This verse warns us that if we think we are standing firm, we should be careful not to fall. Some weaknesses may reappear at unexpected times, and if we are not on guard, we could stumble again, even after thinking we have overcome them. 2 Peter 3:14. Peter encourages us to strive to be blameless and at peace. This emphasizes that even if we have overcome a weakness in the past, we must remain vigilant and work daily to avoid falling again. Let's move on to question 19. What can we do if we have a weakness that we can't seem to get rid of? We must stay on guard and avoid any situation that might cause us to fall into temptation. We must also continue using the methods that have worked in the past to avoid falling back. Additional comments. Matthew 26:41. Jesus advises his disciples to pray constantly to avoid falling into temptation. If we have a persistent weakness, continuous prayer and vigilance are essential for resistance. We must also stay away from situations that could trigger that weakness. 1 Corinthians 10:12, Paul reminds us that if we think we are standing firm, we should be careful not to fall. This teaches us that even if we think we have control over our weaknesses, we must keep taking measures to protect ourselves and not be overly confident. Let's move on to the fourth subheading, How Staying on Guard Benefits us. Let's move on to questions 20 and 21, Part A. What are some benefits of staying on guard? Staying on guard helps us enjoy a clean conscience, obey Jehovah's standards, and experience the joy that comes from doing what is right. Additional comments. Hebrews 11:25. The text teaches us that the temporary pleasures of sin do not compare to the true happiness of obeying Jehovah. Staying on guard allows us to enjoy a clean conscience and the peace that comes from doing what is right. Psalm 19:8. Jehovah's standards bring joy to the heart. This verse teaches us that by obeying His commands and staying vigilant, we experience true happiness and spiritual satisfaction. Let's move on to questions 20 and 21, Part B. If we do our part, what will Jehovah do? 2 Corinthians 4:7. Jehovah will give us the strength we need to resist temptations, as long as we do our part by making daily efforts to remain faithful. Additional comments. 1 Corinthians 10:13. Jehovah promises that He will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear and will always provide a way out. If we do our part to resist temptation, we can trust that Jehovah will give us the support we need to stay firm. 2 Corinthians 4:7. Although we are imperfect and fragile, Jehovah gives us a power that goes beyond normal. If we do our part and strive to remain firm, He will provide us with the additional strength we need to resist temptation and be victorious. Now we will answer the review questions titled, What would you answer? Question 1. In what areas should we stay on guard? We should stay on guard in areas where we are most vulnerable, such as our weak points, less serious sins that can lead to more serious ones, and avoiding situations that may put us at risk of falling into temptation. Question 2. How can we protect ourselves from temptations? We can protect ourselves by identifying our weak points, avoiding steps that lead us toward sin, making firm decisions not to fall into temptations, and maintaining our spiritual activities like prayer, Bible reading, and attending meetings. Question 3. Why should we never let our guard down? We should never let our guard down because our weaknesses can resurface at any moment. Even if we think we have overcome a temptation, we may face it again if we don't stay vigilant and continue using the methods that have helped us resist in the past. Well, these have been the answers for this week's Watchtower study. I hope they are of great help to you, my dear brothers and sisters. We will see each other next week with a new video. I send you a big hug, and may Jehovah bless and protect you always.